Welcome to another episode of Jammin' with Jason. Hey, before we get started today, I wanted to let you know this episode is sponsored by C-Risk Academy. Now, did you know that C-Risk Academy is the #1 on-demand and webinar training platform for internal auditors and professionals in risk management and compliance? With hundreds of on-demand courses and webinars each month, you are sure to find training and certification courses that are relevant to help you do your job better. Their on-demand training gives you the ability to study anywhere, anytime, and on any device, so you can fit in your professional development on your schedule. And you receive a CPE certificate for each course you complete. C-Risk Academy is also running a special for listeners of the podcast where you can save 50% on all courses through November 30th. All you need to do is click on the link in the show notes and use the coupon code JAMMING2019 when you register to get the 50% off discount. So make sure to click on the link in the show notes and get your 50% discount today when you use the coupon code JAMMING2019. Welcome to Jammin' with Jason Mefford, a show where we discuss topics relevant to chief audit executives and professionals in audit, risk, and compliance. We discuss the technical and soft skills needed to navigate the minefields of organizations. You hear best practices and practical advice for helping you advance your career, and we'll even talk about music, mindfulness, and psychology, because we can. So sit back and relax while you listen to the #1 podcast in the world for internal auditors, unscripted and unedited. Well, welcome everybody to another episode of Jammin' with Jason. Hey, today I'm here with longtime friend Matt Kelley. Matt, welcome aboard, man.
Hello, Jason. It is a delight to be here on this podcast with you. My first time ever on Jammin' with Jason.
I know. Well, we be jamming, anyway. No, I know you said you don't have to flatter it, but it's Tom refers to you as the coolest guy in compliance. So I thought, well, how cool would it be, right? Like if the coolest guy in compliance and a rock star get together on a podcast, it would be jamming, wouldn't it?
It absolutely would.
It would be jamming. So for those of you that don't know, Matt Kelley is the editor of Radical Compliance, and we've known each other for, I don't know, 10 or 15 years, somewhere in that range, I think.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, it's been a little while, but wanted to have Matt on because he really is an expert in the compliance space. And so Matt, maybe just give the listeners a little flavor for kind of, where you've come from and kind of what you're doing now and how Tom gave you that coolest guy in compliance sort of thing, because I think you do, you are an icon in this space, if you will, in reporting a lot on what's actually going on in the compliance realm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I have been reporting on these issues in one form or another probably since around 2003 when Sarbanes-Oxley was first passed, and I wound up writing for Compliance Week for a while. I knew very little about corporate compliance back then, but the good news was really not anybody else did either. So we could all fake it collectively and grow into understanding what compliance was. I wound up working at Compliance Week and running the magazine from 2006 until the start of 2016. And then I moved on to writing my own newsletter. Radical Compliance comes out on Friday afternoons. You can sign up for it for free. And my approach has always been, I don't take any ads and I don't charge any subscription fees. So I really don't have too many constituencies to answer to, and so I can give my unvarnished analysis on the compliance, audit, and governance news of the day.
Yep.
And a lot of what I try to do is, I would guess maybe 40% of my readers are ethics and compliance officers on the legal side. Probably another 40% are internal audit executives. And it's about writing about those issues that will straddle both domains and how each side can sort of understand the other's perspective. because when the mess happens, you're both going to be in the room along with a couple of other people, maybe outside counsel and the CISO and the audit firm. You're like, how do we get out of this?
Yep.
You all got to understand the common comprehensive perspective. So that's what I do is I write about a lot of very topical news and I love this stuff. I'll keep on doing it for years.
Well, and I'm glad that you're in that space because, like I said, it's what you put out is important for people to, and you've really kind of carried over your journalism, into more of this topical area. But from a background, you're really kind of a journalist, right? And so,
I am, yeah.
So you're just reporting on what's actually happening, and then it allows people to then kind of figure out, okay, what is it that we need to do with this, right? And I think, like you said, I mean, I remember those days back in the early 2000s when compliance departments were all of a sudden now a big deal, and people have started kind of adding to it. The auditors have been around for a while, but now we have compliance as well. And I know, even still, I can't do math in my head right now, 15, 16 years later, there's still a lot of kind of growing pains of what does audit do, what does compliance do, how do we work together well. That's still kind of going on. But like you said, whenever anything bad happens, usually both of those people are pulled in the room and the fingers get pointed at one or both of them, which is why we're talking today, right? Because it's like the compliance can't just stick their head down and not think or consider internal audit. Internal audit cannot just stick its head down and not consider compliance as well.
Yeah.
So maybe let's talk about some of the things that are kind of going on, because what I want to do is help the auditors kind of understand some of what's going on in the compliance world, so that if it's in their space, if it relates to their organization, that they kind of are aware of it, so they can start thinking about it in their planning and what to kind of do going forward, right?
Sure.
So I know we were talking before we started, the SEC and some of the different enforcement actions and stuff that have been coming out lately. Maybe we can talk a little bit about some of those, kind of some of the lessons learned, from that. And again, maybe things that people should be looking for within their organization so they don't end up in the news like some of these other companies.
Yeah. Well, I think that the big compliance and enforcement story of 2019, what has intrigued me is, so the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act has two parts. There is the criminal part that says you may not bribe a foreign government official, which is investigated and charged by the Justice Department on the criminal side. And then also the civil side, the Securities and Exchange Commission says you must have adequate internal controls to detect and prevent bribes. So we have all these books and records violations. And what I have seen is that the Justice Department is taking a big step back from enforcing the criminal side. They're trying to encourage self-disclosure and then you remediate, but they won't actually bring a criminal charge against the company. But while that slow rolling is happening, we still see a steady, brisk pace of enforcement on the civil side from the Securities and Exchange Commission on poor internal controls. It's kind of weird because essentially the SEC is saying you have faulty internal controls, so you can't figure out if there was a bribe or not, even when the Justice Department had said, we're not going to bother bringing a charge of bribery. So can you have an enforcement action on the civil side when nothing wrong actually was enforced on the criminal side? A lot of people would say that's weird, doesn't really matter because it is what it is, but it raises some really interesting questions about how strong your internal controls are and how audit appreciates the regulatory risks that are still out there and how compliance understands what are the internal control issues that could still leave my company falling on its face. And that's what I think is a big story for 2019.
Well, it is. And I think, again, right, usually the criminal, that's done at the individual level, but the civil is still handled by the corporation, right? So and this is one of the things that I've seen for a long time with compliance is the government's going to come eventually. It just ends up being years later. And so a lot of times people think, oh, I dodged that bullet, nobody's going to know. It's like, no, they're coming. And when they come, the fines are going to come, right? So if we think back, like to the 2008 financial issue, it wasn't until I think, wasn't it 2018, when most of the banks actually finally got their fines.
It
So
can easily take 10 years or
10,
so. And
10,
yeah,
15 years or more, but eventually it will catch up. And ultimately, like you said, even if DOJ doesn't criminally prosecute, if the SEC comes after you, they're still going to give you a fine that you're going to have to pay, and plus everything else that goes along with that, right?
yeah.
Because
So
I think a lot of times people think that the amount of money they have to pay the government is what the risk is, and it's like, no. What about all the wasted time and effort and everything else that you had to go through for the last how many years during the investigation? That's also a cost of it as well.
So to do the sort of the breakdown in your head, you would easily have to pay disgorgement of whatever profits your company got by way of the bribery,
Hmm.
penalties, which could be several $1 million. The penalties could be more than the disgorgement. That is, it's not all the time, but you see it, and then interest on top of that. And then whatever that number is, multiply it by 3 or 4, because that is your legal fees for your
Hmm.
outside counsel, that's for your auditor, that's for all the distraction of your internal man hours, and you suddenly the meter is ticking up and up and up. Um, and then there could potentially be individual enforcement actions where you might get barred from working at a public company, you might lose your accounting license or your law license. On the criminal side, at least in theory, you could wind up with a personal indictment, and then you're in big trouble.
Yep.
So this is still like, you don't want to be here, not under any circumstance.
No, well, and like you said, I mean, kind of that formula that you kind of gave, the discouragement of profits, penalties, interest, multiply by 3 or 4. I remember, I mean, this settled a while ago, but the Walmart Mexico issue finally settled.
Yeah.
It's been a year ago or so now. But I remember when that first came out, in my head, I thought this is going to cost them $1 billion, right? That's just kind
Mm-hmm.
of what I thought, and was kind of teaching people. It's like, look, this is going to come back and bite them. Now, I think the ending penalty ended up only being around 200 million, something like
A
that.
little bit more than two.
Yeah, it was a little
Yeah.
more than 200, but Walmart disclosed they probably spent $1 billion,
They
right?
they disclosed that they paid 1.1 billion since I think 2013
Yeah.
up until now. They'll probably still have ongoing costs after this,
Hmm.
and I am not entirely clear on if that was all of the costs or just their internal improvements. But they paid some law firm out there
Yep.
good money, and so I wouldn't even be surprised if it was more than the 1.1 that they did report.
Yeah. So that's why I think that's good for people to, because again, as the auditors are thinking about this, I don't want them thinking, oh, this is only a $10 million thing. No, it's going to balloon to whatever you might pay. Like, let's say it's a $10 million fine, which isn't very much, but by
Mm-hmm.
the time you start multiplying it, it really has probably a 60 to $100 million impact on your organization, even though you're only paying the government 10 million, right?
It could, yeah.
Yeah. So maybe let's talk about a couple, because I know we were talking about a couple of, almost like little case study kind of things of sharing with people kind of, how some of this stuff comes out, what some of these companies are getting in trouble for,
Mm-hmm.
um, as well, because we were talking a little bit about some of the pre-IPOs that got pulled back, and there's some reasons around that. Maybe some of the stuff, because I know the quad graphics was a big one that you've been talking a lot about lately.
Yeah.
So maybe kind of walk us through, or help us kind of see. Let's give the listeners some kind of real case facts, if you will, of some of the things that other companies are going through, so they can start trying to think, could this apply to my company, and is this something that we should be concerned about as well?
Sure. So I know I said that this is the big story of 2019. I'm actually going to give my first example from 2018, I think September 2018 or so, where the SEC took an enforcement action against Sanofi, the pharmaceutical firm,
Hmm.
for bribery offenses and internal control failures that happened with its Middle East operations. And what intrigued me, and this is not an uncommon fact pattern, was that Sanofi's distributors in the Middle East, they were receiving credit notes from Sanofi that the distributors could then use to offset for money the distributor might owe back to Sanofi, or, and this is the key detail, convert those credit notes into cash. Jason, I will give you one guess where that cash went once it was converted. So it was, of course, converted into bribes and the various other failures, but that stood out to me because I wrote a whole post about how a compliance officer who is trying to implement effective control over third parties, you really would need to understand that accounting policies like that do carry risk. And how would you try to rectify or amend those policies so you could seal off that risk? And what strikes me is if I talk to ethics and compliance officers who are wonderful people, but they are largely lawyers, if I say, are you worried about SEC enforcement, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act? Oh yeah, totally. And it's third parties, man, my resellers, distributors, they're always going to, that's my risk. I said, yes. Do you understand what a credit note is and how it could be used? Like, no, that's an accounting department thing. But what I don't know, and actually, if you had perspective on this, I think I'd be curious to hear it. How often do the audit and accounting people also understand that a policy like that might seem like a good business process because they don't understand the regulatory risks of having it? And I'm wondering if there is a disconnect. There's certainly a disconnect from compliance officers who don't appreciate all of this accounting policy nuance they need to think about. But I wouldn't be surprised if there's also disconnect vice versa, that the accounting people might not know the regulatory risks that they're carting around thanks to their policies.
Well, no, I think it is, and it can go both ways, and like you said, depending on, let's say, what the background of the compliance person is. If they're mainly attorneys, then obviously they're going to have some blind spots. So that's a great word that I like to use, right? Is an attorney might just have some blind spots because they don't know, they haven't experienced it. An auditor might have blind spots because maybe they don't understand, the details of the regulation or some of the, litigation aspects or legal aspects of it. Business owners or managers, that are actually running these parts of the business have blind spots as well, right? Because they're just trying to get stuff done. And it's funny, the Sanofi thing with the credit, what they call them? They weren't credit memos, but they were
credit notes.
Credit notes. Okay. That's one of those where, this is why it's so important to get all of those people together and actually discuss openly and honestly what's going on, so that each of those people, you're going to have blind spots, but somebody else isn't. And somebody can raise their hand and go, well, just a minute, right? A credit note is really this, right? Because to me, it almost seems like that was an attempt to continue to bribe, but meet the letter of the law, because we're not giving them cash, we're giving them a credit note, right? And, it's the old thing, if it walks like a duck, if it talks like a duck, and it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck.
Yep.
Even if it's got, different clothes on or whatever, right? And people have to kind of think about that, because that, I'm sure for that one, that was, again, a pretty big fine and penalty that goes along with it. And don't try to be too cutesy of thinking that you can get away with something. Because if effectively, if what you're doing is still bribery, they're still going to come back at you regardless of what you call it.
Yeah. Now, I've got my next two cases. I'm going to get to quad graphics at the end because that's such a big and late breaking case. It deserves its own time. But right now, I wanted to also mention Microsoft and Polycom. They both had enforcement actions. I think Polycom at the end of last December, and then Microsoft over the summer. These are much more tangible and common sort of traps as opposed to the credit notes with Sanofi. But both Microsoft and Polycom, they were fined when their resellers, and again, it's always the third party. It's the reseller, distributor, the local agent, always them. They were asking Microsoft and Polycom corporate headquarters, could we please offer extra discounts to customers that we want to sell the software to? And then the senior business review people at corporate headquarters said, well, yeah, sure. Why do you need the discount? Oh, because it's competition. And that was it. That was the evidence and the justification for these discounts. Um, Yet again, what happens, of course, is the discount gets granted, supposedly to be passed along to the end customer. The end customer in the real world never sees the discount. The discount is pocketed,
By
and
the
then it
reseller.
becomes cash for the bribe to the end user, who is the assistant minister of whatever in some foreign country. Um, so that is a very common sort of a thing. That's a very common scam. But what it is it's always the same request: is we need an extra discount. With Microsoft's, they specifically wanted a discount of, I think it was 27.2%. I don't know why 0.3% would have triggered more red flags, but whatever. They
Well, the more
specifically
specific,
said
the more real it must be, right?
it could be, yeah. They specifically said they will always come and they'll ask the parent company, can we get this discount? And then the parent company will say, well, why? Competition. But there's no digging into, is that actually true? And really what you need, if you want to govern this problem well, is you need to grant these discounts on a case-by-case basis, where the reseller provides hard evidence of, why do we need this discount for this specific customer? What else have we heard? Can we get that evidence? Can we put it into a file? Can we have all of this documented so that if some government regulator asks about these transactions, we can show that we did our due diligence on giving this discount, which did not happen with Microsoft and Polycom. They had like some sort of a senior business conduct desk at headquarters that would just say, yeah, sure, competition, you go ahead, take your discount. Now, I don't know all the ins and outs of every piece of financial software out there, but I do know that there's plenty of financial software systems that would let you collect all of this data and hold it in a single repository so the evidence can be contained with the transaction and the discount you want to give. But you need to do that. I'm not necessarily saying it's easy, although it is easier today than it would have been in like 2009 or 2011. But that's the sort of stuff that you need to think through. So now we're at a regulatory compliance issue where the solution is going to be checking the accounting policy, or what are the evidence standards we want, and it's IT systems. Do we actually have the IT systems to gather this data reliably and store it in case we face a regulatory review? It all makes sense when you spell it out like that, but if you're just an ethics and compliance lawyer who is worried about due diligence as a concept and third-party governance as a concept, you may not necessarily have the sophistication around those specific issues, because they don't teach this stuff in law school. They teach law in law school. Right. So it can be very difficult for some companies to figure out this is the right approach to govern third-party risks around anti-corruption.
Yeah. Well, and I think in both of these examples that you gave with, Microsoft Polycom, it doesn't appear that those companies were knowingly, right, complicit with this. But the fact that, again, they were still held liable for it because they didn't maybe ask as much in the due diligence as they should have, right? They just accepted the extra discounts and, oh, why competition? Oh, okay, that sounds good, right? That a lot of times you can unwittingly kind of be pulled into these things. But like you said, it's like, well, so again, maybe for people to learn, anytime there's like significantly favorable pricing to different people, or like that, if you're doing a reseller model, where you're selling to them, they're selling to the customer, so you don't actually see the end stuff.
Yep.
Any discount you're giving, you don't know where that's going, because there's a good chance they're probably still charging their end customer full price, but they could be using that money then for whatever they choose to do, right?
That is very true. Yeah.
So variations in pricing, and especially when you get these exceptions when it comes to pricing, those could be some areas where some of this stuff could be hidden. Which again, well, there's two examples of that's exactly what happened there.
Which brings us to Quad Graphics, where they had an enforcement action. I want to say it was September 27th or the very end of September, where this enforcement action is just, you have to sit back and marvel at it at an academic level. Quad Graphics violated probably every block and tackle compliance process you should have in the book. They messed up on due diligence. They messed up on investigations. They messed up on setting a strong anti-corruption tone. What specifically happened was, I'll give you a great example. So Quad Graphics sells marketing services, printing services, and all this. And they had operations in Peru that were bidding on a government printing contract in Peru. And Peru is a highly corrupt country, so to no surprise, the Peruvian government official wanted a bribe. So the local Quad Graphics business unit, Quad Peru, arranged to funnel the bribe to the government official through 4 sham vendors, 3 of which were in the same physical address, and all 4 were owned by the same person. So any modicum of due diligence would have turned up that this smells like a dead fish, and this is not cool. But they didn't do it.
Yeah, and because with that, Matt, it was that those were actually in the records, right? I mean, this is one of those examples where they were just totally sloppy because, a lot of companies do run, vendor matches, and some of these different tests that would hopefully identify that, right? Hey, we've got 4 vendors that have the same physical address. Why, right?
Exactly.
And they weren't even trying to hide it in the records. I mean, if somebody would have done that, or I think if I remember right from what we were talking before, there were even like duplicate invoice numbers, right? That were the same invoice numbers being paid.
They were,
times.
I think, literally duplicate invoices. I know that there were duplicate invoice numbers, but the fact patterns in this case were long, so I'm a little fuzzy on all details.
Yeah.
But I'm pretty sure in several instances they were the exact same invoice. But why wouldn't they be if it's the same guy and he's living in the same address? But it's, hey, sure, yeah. Duplication all around. But you're right. I mean, they didn't catch even that sort of modicum, basic block and tackle anti-corruption measure. Didn't work. What else had happened here? So I really enjoyed this was that these bribes were happening in the early 2010s. So by 2013, bribe payments worried some of the local Quad Peru people enough that they took their concerns to the Latin America finance director for Quad Graphics, who is a U.S. resident and working in the corporate parent here in the United States. And they showed this person the invoices that were questionable. They said, we're not really sure what we should do here. The U.S. executive, and this I'll quote directly from the enforcement order, advised the Peru finance managers do not forward any more invoices directly to him being the U.S. guy, and then he would look into that matter. And then, of course, he never looked back into it. So that was in 2013. By 2015, that Quad Peru finance manager who had some concerns and went to the boss, what do we do? Don't send me any more invoices. I'll look into it. And then he never did. 2 years later, a new Quad Peru finance manager is there. He also has concerns. He goes back to the same U.S. finance manager and says all over again, we have concerns. And now the finance manager goes to legal, and then it becomes a thing. And now suddenly we're self-disclosing and we're off to the races. But in 2013, this U.S. executive says, don't send me any more evidence. I promise I'll look into it. And then in 2015, now he actually looked into it. So now we have really a failure of follow-up. I would say a failure of personnel, a failure of the tone of, I don't know how close he was to the top, but there was not a good tone wherever this person was. So we had more failures of not taking these allegations seriously, which is, I think, more troubling than the duplicate invoices.
Well, and I think from it, because that's where, because they didn't do anything about it for 2 years.
Yeah.
Again, this is one of those things. So, especially if you're the compliance person or the audit person, and this has happened to me, I don't know how many times in my career, anytime somebody says, I'll look into it, don't worry about it. Well, that's just like a huge red flag.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, well, you look into it, but guess what? I'm going to follow back up with you next month and see what you did. Right. So it was not only a failure on the US finance director not following up, but maybe those other people should have followed up as well. So, if you're the compliance or auditor and somebody tells you that, your spidey senses should go up right away. Right.
They should.
They
It
should.
didn't. So now you get into all sorts of questions about what is this company's culture of compliance and tone at the top. And those are questions that U.S. prosecutors are going to ask. And when they're asking those questions, you have a much bigger, more serious problem than how do you not catch the duplicate invoices. So yeah, you're spot on with what you're saying here.
Yeah, because again, if if they start asking those questions about culture of compliance, all of a sudden it totally goes different, right? I mean,
Yeah,
from the U.S. federal sentencing guidelines kind of get thrown out the window at that point.
mm-hmm.
And it's just you're going in naked. They can pretty much do to you whatever they want to do.
I mean, look, if you've got some sloppy controls or sloppy IT systems and you miss duplicate invoices, that is unpleasant, but that is like an IT failure and maybe a corporate settlement. If prosecutors start getting it into their head that somebody is not taking this seriously, then suddenly we're looking at personal indictments, people getting fired, people losing their licenses. There's only so many people who are going to fall into that. And you, listener, whoever you may be, like, you don't want to be on that radar screen. So that's when these things suddenly become much more serious, is when they're thinking, do they have a bad tone at the top? Are they not taking the culture seriously? That can lead to much larger fines, and it can lead to personal charges against various executives, and you don't want to be there. I had one other big quad graphics issue I wanted to raise, but I also have one funny quad graphics issue to raise. Aside from all of this fixing government contracts, Quad Graphics also was trying to bribe judges in Peru to fix a tax case where they were paying $20,000 to the district judge to try and win the case, and they lost. So first off, the guy who was fixing it, they were using a corrupt law firm down there, refunded the money to Quad Peru because they didn't fix the case. But then they had to appeal. So then the price of the bribe went up from $20,000 to $50,000, because when you're fixing an appellate case, of course, it's more expensive.
Well, yeah.
Your judges are higher up the food chain. But you could read this story and like, you got to be kidding me, all the way down. And there's even more to the Quad Graphics case I won't get into. But the big issue I always thought stood out to me with Quad Graphics was this was the company that came into being. Quad Graphics for a long time was privately held, family owned for decades. And then in 2010, it purchased a much larger publicly traded Canadian printing business. And then suddenly Quad Graphics becomes this global behemoth, and they're in countries all over the world, and they've got 16,000 employees. And this company was not prepared for life as a publicly traded business. And that's what tripped them up. They had no compliance program. When they did finally hire a compliance person, it was at the director level. That person had no compliance or technology experience, and it took them years and years to catch up. And those years and years, that's when all this stuff in Peru happened, and it happened in several other countries as well. So I saw that more as like a failure to assess your strategic risks.
Mm-hmm.
That was the original sin here. And all this other funny stuff about fixing tax cases in Peru, and there was issues in Cuba and China and everywhere else, all symptoms of the underlying flaw or the underlying illness was that the board and the C-suite, and frankly, whoever was providing some audit or risk assessment services to them at that time, like they didn't say, your compliance posture is going to change radically when you do this, and you need to plan now. And that didn't happen, and look where they are.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that's very common with lots of companies, right? I mean, sometimes your growth can be so quick that you're not really prepared from an infrastructure standpoint. But I really appreciate that you brought up. I mean, probably the biggest thing, like you said, it was actually a failure to assess the strategic risk properly. Mm-hmm. And I see this over and over again when companies get themselves in trouble. Um, um, too much of the time we're focused down at the risk level, at the process level, lower down in the organization, that
Yeah.
we forget or like totally overlook some of the what should be glaring strategic risks, right?
Yeah.
So again, I mean, if you look at this, it's like, they start off as a smaller company here in the US, and all of a sudden they buy this Canadian company. They're in lots of different countries. It's like, okay, hold it. Somebody at that point should say, hey, now we're going to have to operate in, I don't know, 15 countries instead of one. Maybe that raises our risk a little bit. Maybe we have to do things a little different. But apparently nobody really asked that question,
No.
or the same thing of, hey, we're just a private company and now we're going to go public. Well, again, somebody should be asking questions. What is that going to do? What's that different, right? If you're dealing with government, you're doing government contracting, because again, as we talked about kind of to begin with, I mean, SEC is serious about FCPA stuff, right? Well,
Mhm.
FCPA, it usually relates to bribery and corruption, which who's the other side of that? It's usually government officials. So, if your organization doesn't do anything with the government, okay, your risk is probably lower. But if you are, and you're doing business in some of these higher risk countries with the government, like we had the example of Peru, somebody's got to realize that there's probably some funny business going to be going on, because
Yeah.
there's certain jurisdictions in the world that you just can't get anything done without playing by the rules.
And what also strikes me is I agree with everything you say, but you are getting people to try to think about answers to these questions. But it raises the more fundamental mistake was that an event happened in Quad Graphics' life, and nobody stopped to say, wait, what questions should we be asking
Mhm.
as a result of this change from privately held US company to publicly traded global thing? No audit function asked, should we therefore start to audit our anti-corruption risks? The SEC enforcement action specifically says that the internal audit function did not step up to assess the anti-corruption risks. Now, that's all the questions that you were just asking, and the answers vary, but nobody took the moment to say now is the time to ask these questions, because we just went through a big thing, or we're about to go through a big thing, which would even have been better. But nobody asked the right questions at the right time, or thought now it's the time to ask questions. And that's the through line for all of Quad Graphics' many compliance lessons.
Well, and it's not just them. I mean, again, they're just one example
Yeah.
that happens to be in the news recently. But
Yes.
I mean, this story we've heard how many? I mean, maybe not this egregious, in all of its different aspects, but these different sub storylines you hear all the time. With
Absolutely.
companies that are making some of these same mistakes. So
You could shift the conversation or shift the example to say, that you are a consumer sales business and you're going to start offering online channels for sales. That is
mhm.
a big change, and you need to stop and ask, what are our new cybersecurity risks going to be? Now, I don't know what they're going to be, but really, I just changed the word anti-corruption to cybersecurity. But exactly the same stuff holds true in both cases. Big life change for the organization, and nobody took the time to say, what are the risk
Yeah.
implications of this? And that's what bites you in the end.
Well, and that's why, again, hopefully, us talking about this today will get some people, to think about it. I guess for me, especially as kind of a career auditor, the thing that I hate the most about the Quad Graphics thing is that damning statement in there that internal audit didn't do anything,
Hmm.
right? I mean, because that's actually in the government report, I think that you were saying, right?
Yeah, there was no internal audit assessment of anti-corruption risks.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I mean, like, if from there, the rest is just variations on the theme. The rest is just, well, what else was going to happen? I don't. It didn't know exactly that it would happen in this way, but you could see from a mile away. If you go through a big change like that and you don't assess the risks, like, you're going to hit something. It happened to be with Peru and China and Cuba for this company, but it's going to be something else for some other company if they don't do this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's asking the questions, not taking, just kind of the pat answer. Like we said, the Sanofi issue of, why do you need to offer it? Well, because, it's
Competition.
yeah, or no, but it was Microsoft Polycom, right? The extra
Yeah, it
discounts, right? Was for them, or stuff with Sanofi with those credit notes. Okay, well, what is a credit note exactly? How can you use that? What would you use that for? Are they convertible to cash? Right. That's one of the reasons why on coupons are not convertible for cash, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's a whole other thing that can go on behind that and controls that have to be around those if things like that can actually be converted for cash, because it's an easy way for people to steal.
Yeah. But and even to your point about maybe using coupons instead of notes that could be converted into cash, it requires the accounting and audit experience to know, well, we could solve the problem this way, with the compliance perspective to know we need to solve this because the SEC is enforcing it. And the two have to come together to be able to figure this out and then get your company into a position that it can avoid these sorts of troubles, because they're not going away. The SEC is not going to stop enforcing this.
Yep. Whew. Well, Matt, we've given people a lot of stuff to think about today, and some good, I think, actual, real life stuff. I know sometimes when we talk about some of these concepts, it's a little bit in the abstract. So we actually did talk about some actual companies, some of the things that they're going on with. And again, this is all public information, so it's nothing that's really confidential. But it's things that people are actually dealing with. And so again, if you're listening to this, think about how do some of these things that we talked about today, how might they relate back to your organization? What questions may you need to ask? What, internal controls are obviously an important thing, right? Because, again, the SEC is using that as part of their basis for determining, if they're going to come after you and how they're going to come after you. So, and audit, risk, and compliance professionals play, and I think, an increasingly important role in organizations, because as the fines get bigger and bigger, and the penalties and the kind of cost of doing business, it's not the right word, but effectively, like, the government imposed sanctions, if you will, almost putting companies out of business, or no longer allowing them to operate a business, is going to continue to be a bigger and bigger risk as we move forward. I think so.
It's going to be a drag on corporate operations and efficiency. And and all the other attendant reputation harm, the civil litigation, all the other headaches, like, it all boils into exactly what you're saying.
Yep, exactly. Well, hey, Matt, I appreciate you taking the time with me today to go through this and to share your wisdom with everybody that's out there.
Well, it's been a lot of fun, Jason. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Matt. And that's a wrap. Thanks for listening to today's episode of Jamming with Jason. Keep on rocking in the audit world. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll catch you later on the next show. If you'd like to earn continuing professional education for listening to today's episode, head on over to C-Risk Academy at ondemand.criskacademy.com. And that's C as in the letter C, riskacademy.com. Not only do you get a CPE certificate, but you also will have access to the video version of today's show. The views and opinions expressed on this show are that of the individuals and not of their respective organizations.